Happy to be here at RSA once again with my friend Doug. And we're going to talk, yes, about what Hacking the Planet taught us about defending supply chain attacks. We may not look like hackers, but trust me, we're going to talk about trust a little bit here too, right?
Maybe a little bit of zero trust.
Well, let's see what happens. Maybe AI too? Well, those are not passwords you're not going to hear again, right, this week.
Nah.
All right, so we'll pass this disclaimer. My name is Ismael Valenzuela. And both of us were SANS instructors and authors. I've been teaching for SANS for about 12 years now. Co-author of a couple of classes on zero trust, cyber defense, essentially, right? Secure architectures and engineering. And co-author of another class with Doug McKee on product security testing, defending against supply chain attacks. And today we're going to be sharing with you some of our research that we have done over the last few years and what we have learned from that. And hopefully we can give you some practical tips, things that you can walk away with. I'm also the VP of Threat Research and Intelligence at BlackBerry. And Doug?
Well, I guess the cat's out of the bag, but the name's Douglas McKee. I've been in the industry for 15 or so years, mostly on the offensive side. SANS instructor and lead author of 568, which we're going to talk about some of the concepts in our research behind that class today. And then I also work as the executive director of threat research at SonicWall. And I think that brings us to our main topic today.
Let's get started.
And that is we're going to talk about supply chain attacks. And I think it's extremely important in our industry today that we kind of define what we're talking about before we talk about it, because there's so many overloaded terms. I think you'll see quite a few presentations do this. So for the context of our talk and the way Ismael and I think about supply chain attacks, we actually break this down into two main categories of attacks. The first one is the one that everybody seems to know about. It's pretty obvious. The second one sometimes gets forgotten about. So what are those two areas? The first area of supply chain attacks is what we like to call the breach-based type of supply chain attacks. So think your classic SolarWinds, for example. This is when a vendor or a company gets breached, and as a result of that breach, they can make a code modification or some type of modification to the way things operate that their customers get infected because of that third-party breach. As a defender, these can be extremely frustrating as you have no control over whether or not that vendor or product that you're using, that they get breached. There's nothing you can do to defend against that. We're going to talk a little bit about how we think you can help yourself as defenders against those attacks here shortly. The second category of attacks is when there's a library or SDK that has a vulnerability in it. And because that library or SDK or development kit has a vulnerability into it, when you use products that use that underlying library or that dependency, you end up inheriting that vulnerability. And it's coming through the supply chain. So it's not the vendor itself that you're purchasing or that product that you're using that has that vulnerability. It's that underlying library. The classic example we can talk about here in recent times is Log4j. All right, so as the title promises, we're going to first talk about hacking the planet before we jump into supply chain attacks a little bit further. But we're just setting the stage to say what we're about to talk about, right? So we're going to go through a couple examples of things hacking related that we've experienced, and probably too long to say out loud.
Just,
but,
yeah, at least you don't have gray hair.
Yeah, a couple of years. And then what that means from a supply chain perspective. So the first example I'm going to give is a medical hacking project that I worked on a couple years ago. You might have seen my talk 2 years ago at RSA. We go into this super in depth, but it's around an infusion pump. Now I want you to think about this from a supply chain perspective as we move forward. This infusion pump, me and my other researcher was able to determine about 5 or 6 different CVEs or vulnerabilities in it, but it only could be compromised because of the first vulnerability in this attack. And an infusion pump is a proprietary product, but they were using open source software in their supply chain. And if we actually take a look online, there's a library on GitHub called dbus.json bridge, and we can look through the commit history, and this is what actually led us on to starting this research. We can see a bug was fixed. Fix sending JSON characters containing fix sending JSON containing % characters. Now, if I have any hackers in the room, that might pipe your interest, because that immediately lends itself to a format string vulnerability. And sure enough, if we look down further in the code in the commit, you can see that they're repairing a format string vulnerability. And this, right here, these 2 lines of code is the entire reason why the infusion pump was able to be compromised. So what does this mean in far as supply chain attacks? It's very, very important, if we're going to defend against supply chain attacks, that we understand what are our dependencies to the larger products that we're using. Without that understanding of knowing that we have these dependencies, when a vulnerability is reported, we don't know that we're vulnerable to that or that we should be doing something about it. So that's the first lesson learned. The second project I'm going to talk about, this was even further ago, I think maybe at this point 5 years ago or so, was hacking an industrial control system. This is something called a building controller. I guarantee in a building like this, there's probably multiple building controllers controlling things like the lights, the HVAC systems, room pressurization, humidity, all that stuff is often done through a building controller. And again, not here to talk about this project, discovered a vulnerability to compromise this device that led to complete control over this device. And what's interesting about this is not actually the vulnerabilities themselves, but when we were able to do some testing, what we were able to do as a result of this vulnerability. In a lot of cases, we were able to leverage this vulnerability, not necessarily, of course, to control the building controller, but that wasn't the main point. We could actually jump to other systems. And all of a sudden, the compromisation of an ICS device or this building controller allowed us to jump to other networks and then get into things that were behind the perimeter. So what's the lesson learned here from a supply chain perspective? Most of these ICS systems or other critical infrastructure is often systems that we really don't understand what's going on underlyingly. If we don't understand the technology, we definitely need to make sure that we isolate the technology. And of course, the follow-on is, what can we do to understand the technology? And I think we're going to get into that here in just a few minutes. But enough stories from me. Ismael, do you have anything to talk about?
Yeah, and also thinking about what you were mentioning about the isolating and not trust what we don't understand. It's also about dependencies, right? I mean,
That's
you could
right.
see that in the diagram, understanding how things are connected, how the data flows, right? How people access these applications, and what could an attacker see if they access these systems. So that's all part of this philosophy that we're discussing here, what we call think red, act blue, right? Think as an attacker to become a better defender. Or what we're learning from these hacking the planet situations. I have done a lot of, maybe not as many as you, product security testing over the years, testing of devices that are often used in shipping facilities, for example, that just read barcodes, right? What can go wrong with that? Again, you look at the dependencies, and these systems are connected to a server. That server is connected to maybe the corporate network, and there's a lot of other things that an attacker could do from there. But I just picked this one because I have seen a lot of stories in the media, like this one with Florida, right, the water plant hack. And we keep seeing these things over and over again. Now, the story I'm going to share with you is not related to that water plant in Florida. This is a test that I did years ago in a water plant in Europe. Small country, but a really large city and very well known with a lot of population. And I landed there 9 a.m. on a Monday. I get access to the network. And I was supposed to do a penetration testing on the audit of the IT network that, if we would be compromised, even though there should be segmentation and air gap networks and all that between IT and OT, what is the reality, right? Have you ever seen anything like that, like jumping from the IT network onto the OT network?
It's possible.
It's possible, right, in many cases. Well, so I tell you, by noon, I already had access to one of the systems that provided access to the OT network. And at that point, it was pretty much game over. I had administrative privileges on this box. And it would be awesome to tell you that it was really complicated. I had to reverse engineer a lot of things. And no, not really. It was a combination of a well-known vulnerability with what you see here, default credentials. And in some cases, hard-coded credentials that you can find on many of these products. So you can see here a vulnerability, right? This is from 2010. On the Siemens software, WinCC, SCADA systems. Now, of course, that it's 14 years ago? We don't have any of these things these days, right?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Well,
fixed all those.
Let me see. What if we actually check for this common weakness? It's not a vulnerability, right? It's a common weakness that is found as part of many vulnerabilities. If you look for that one, CWE 259, this is what you're going to find today. Vulnerabilities like this in lots of software packages that you may use in your own environment, right? And by the way, this is what's public. This is what's available out there. But if you start doing this type of analysis, this part of this type of product security testing with a lot of other products that you have in your organization, you're going to find, as we have found, right, that there's a lot of things that are hard-coded or credentials in clear text in memory that attackers could leverage as part of their attack chain to elevate privileges or to get further access into the organization. And some of those may not be reported. So what have we learned from hacking the planet, from all of these different stories? Age of a threat is irrelevant. Sometimes we may have a researcher or an analyst or somebody in the vulnerability team saying, oh, but this has been out there for 13, 14 years. This must be patched, right? And what we find out is that it doesn't really matter that much the age. It's about the usability. That's the think red part. How does the attacker see it? If the attacker is able to exploit this, it doesn't really matter if it's been out there for a long time or not. For that particular story, it's funny that when I did this, obviously I handed over my report to the customer and described everything that I did. I was able to add my user to the local admin group, right? So great, right? All the recommendations, you know what to do. 6 months later, I was asked to do a retest. And I was...
Wasn't still there, was it?
It was still there, yeah. First thing I would check, is my user still on that machine? Yes, it was still there. 6 months later, a water plant, critical infrastructure. In many cases, we're doing this just for compliance purposes, right? Just to have a check. But is that really what we should be doing? We should be talking more about threats and about risk and impact. So that's what we're going to be doing now. How do we translate this into the Act Blue piece? How can we translate this into actionable defense? Well, we were thinking about that in this context of product security testing, and we thought these are the questions we should be asking ourselves. Every time we connect, whether it's an infusion pump or any of these IoT devices, or even something like Dropbox, or we use a new application on our corporate phones or on a laptop, do we really know what's the risk that we're introducing on our network? How does those products connect to the vendors? How do we get them patched? What are the dependencies? How does that change my whole threat model? And in most cases, what we found out is organizations just follow best practices, right? And there's nothing wrong with those. Those are focused on compliance, and there's nothing wrong with segmentation, with multi-factor authentication, with implementing zero trust concepts, which is great, right? Pretty sure you're going to hear a lot of that throughout the entire week. But just because it's something good for the majority of organizations, does it really mean that it's going to address all these issues that we found here? And my wife, she's a health coach, and we usually have these conversations. Thankfully, I don't have to talk that much about IT at home, right? Cybersecurity. And one of the things that you probably have seen as well is that you have friends or relatives that they went on a diet, right? Or they're taking some vitamins, and it's like, you know what? Dude, you should be taking more vitamin D because this is awesome. You take vitamin D and you're going to feel amazing, right? Or these reports that say, if you drink more coffee, you're going to have your risk of a heart attack reduced by this much percent, right? But is that really good for everybody? So this is similar to what we are doing with product security testing. I was doing some research because, actually, Doug, you don't like coffee, right?
I do not.
But
I'm a tea drinker.
Tea drinker. I love coffee. He knows it. I had to have a lot of coffee this morning. And you probably know people that they cannot really metabolize coffee. And why is that? I did some research because my wife's the same thing. Like, she would love to have coffee, but she cannot have it. She gets sick. And I'm like, what really determines that? It turns out is this genotype CYP1A2. It's an enzyme that determines whether you will metabolize coffee or not. So if you have that enzyme, you're going to be able to probably metabolize it fast, and coffee is going to be good for you. It will probably decrease your, I'm not a doctor, right? So don't follow any advice I'm giving here. But it's probably going to, based on research, decrease your risk of a heart attack. But if you're a slow coffee metabolizer because you don't have this enzyme, it can actually increase that risk. Long story short, knowing that DNA, right, doing that DNA testing can tell you if a food is good for you. It determines not just how we look on the outside, but also how we look in the inside, right? And that's something we need to know.
So you're suggesting that the same thing isn't good for everybody.
Absolutely. Same thing with product security testing, right? We could all follow these best practices, MFA, have endpoint security. You probably have read a lot of these things at the end of all the threat reports, right? We have like 5 pages talking about malware and then 2 little paragraphs saying, follow these best practices. Of course, we all do that, right? Or try to do that. But is that going to be enough to address a supply chain attack? Something like Log4j? And if you do that, you're going to follow somebody else's threat model. It's not your own threat model. You're going to follow somebody else's recommendations, not necessarily the recommendations you need for your own environment. And we have a lot of cases where we have found that by doing product security testing, you can see things that are not public, like those default credentials, right? Or credentials that are in clear text in memory. And those systems are going to be connected to systems that process information that is sensitive, that are going to be used by specific users, that is specific to your environment. If you don't bring all of that into your own threat model, whatever you're going to apply, it's just going to be generic. It may not be good enough for you, or it may actually be bad for you if we don't do this type of testing. So essentially, long story short, what we do with product security testing is like that DNA testing, knowing what's the weakest link. Now let's talk about what you can do with all of this. And if nothing else, I would say that this is probably one of the things that will bring the most value to this conference or to this talk, because we found that nobody had done something like this, putting together an end-to-end process of how to do this type of risk assessment in practical ways when you introduce new products into your own environment. So, Doug, would you like to talk about that?
Well, of course, you're welcome to take a picture of the slide, but actually, I'm not very creative. Like, this is the best I can do when it comes up to graphics or not. But luckily, we have some people at SANS that did a fantastic job making a poster of this with a lot more detail on it. So if you want to go to sans.com and look for the poster, you can actually download it right from the website. But what's interesting here is, getting back to the theme of the talk, is we said what hacking the planet taught us about supply chain attacks. So if you look at this methodology, what we've done here is it's very similar to what an attacker goes through in their methodologies to use and find vulnerabilities to exercise against you. What we've done is we've incorporated the think red, act blue mentality, and there's parts here that tell you, okay, because you have found this, now do this defensively. And that's the overall concept here that we're talking about with product security testing. And it was pretty interesting to find that if you Google product security testing before we released this publicly, no one had published like how to do it. And so that's the biggest takeaway from this research. So we're going to take a few minutes and walk through at a very high level some of this process and how it can help you in your defense posture. So if we zoom in for a second on the beginning of the process, okay, there's several steps here. The main one I'm going to talk about is the concept of online product research. And this is essentially another terminology to say open source intelligence or OSINT. And what's interesting about online product research in the terms of our flowchart is this is a never done task. In every other step that we will talk about within this flowchart, there's always the room to then continue online product research or OSINT. And we don't want to ignore, before you get started, you should know what's out there, right? It's very, very possible that someone else has published a test result for the product you're looking at. You can find, obviously, vulnerabilities have been published for that product or other attacks. We also need to be gathering our test or our build environment requirements. What you're going to do in your organization, you want to make sure that your test environment mimics very closely or exactly for your production environment. And of course, all the jokes about don't test in production, that's not typically a good idea.
We're not supposed to do that?
That's what I've been told anyway.
And about hardware appliances, right? In many cases, we can even find like the components, the chips that are inside of these hardware appliances without even having to crack it open, which is probably not a good thing.
Yeah, there's especially things on the FCC ID website, right? A lot of people get stuck on, well, I'm going to use this firewall, and I don't have the funds to buy an extra one and like tear it apart and look at all the chips and all the fun stuff. Guess what? A lot of times you don't have to. There's actually documentation online, like Ismael's talking about, where you can actually see all the internals of the product as well. But moving on, all of this leads to probably one of the biggest steps in our process is what we've called basic enumeration. And this is essentially the same thing that hackers do, which is you can't hack something you don't know how it works. You have to first gain an understanding of how your target or your technology at a pretty deep level before you can spot security flaws. So what we want to do defensively as an organization is that same concept. And I don't mean go to vendor X's website and read their marketing material on how their product works, right? That's not what I'm referring to. What I'm saying is really understand the underlying technologies. We talk about looking at dependencies, looking at the files that are running, looking at what processes are running in memory. And all of this is an information gathering phase. Don't just say, oh, process X takes a JSON file. Okay, what does it do with that JSON file? How does it parse that JSON file? Where does that JSON file come from? Right? All those are the type of questions we need to be asking during basic enumeration. And this is a gathering phase, a technical detailed gathering phase to then use that information to make defensive decisions. So what do we do, Ismael, when we gather all that information from basic enumeration?
That's one of the key phases here in this diagram, because usually what we see is that companies will do just a pen test, right? They're going to be analyzing a product, and they may do just a quick pen test. They do a network scan, maybe a port scan. Maybe they have some malware analysis skills. They may do some memory analysis. And then they write a report, and that's it, right? But that's not really telling us much about what an attacker could do. We need to go deeper, and we need to do a threat model based on that. Does anybody do threat modeling here? Applications? Okay,
so good number of hands.
Good number. Stride, is that something that you probably use? Stride, I would say
one
pretty
head
much.
Shaking, yeah, two.
Yeah, pretty much everybody that raised their hand before. Is anybody not going to raise their hand regardless of what I ask? Like, most of you. All right, thank you. Yeah, that's what I suspected. So with threat modeling here, well, we don't have access to the code, right? I bet that a lot of you that are doing threat modeling today, you do this on the things that you already own, on software you have access to, or the code you have access to, which is great, right? Embedding that in the software development lifecycle. But here we're doing some black box testing. In most cases, we don't have access to the source code, right? But still, doing a threat model is important. The main 4 questions we want to answer here is, what are we working on? Having data flow diagrams with visual diagrams, for example, like this, could be very helpful, where we, based on the output of basic enumeration, we just look at how the data flows, the different components. That is going to help us to understand better the system that we're trying to analyze, and also to determine the scope of what our analysis is going to be focused on. Then the second question of the threat modeling manifesto, which is, what can go wrong? Stride could be useful, but what I have found over the years is that if you do, Stride could be very theoretical, and you could spend weeks, months doing Stride on something, and those things may not even happen, ever. Doing a combination of that type of brainstorming quickly with something like attack trees could be a lot more practical. And we're going to show you some examples on how you can do that using AI these days, right? Get you started. And then once you have that, the next question is, well, what can you do? What are you going to do about it? So that's the big question, right? Your risk analysis, finalizing that analysis, saying what are the countermeasures that I'm going to apply based on the risks that I have identified, prioritizing them based on impact and likelihood.
And that's coming down later in the flow chart as well.
Down the pipe. Yep.
Absolutely. And I think what's important is the output of this threat model, it can provide you recommendations specific to your organization, right? They're not industry best practices. You're taking into account, how am I going to use this tool? Maybe, here an example would be something like Zoom. Zoom is something that a lot of our organizations use. But maybe you're not going to, maybe your threat model says that, hey, uploading a file to Zoom is a risk that we're not willing to accept, right? And then we can not use that feature or block that feature. That's going to be custom to your organization, not the same everywhere else. And what's funny about threat modeling, Ismael, is do you ever end up with more questions than answers?
Absolutely, and that's a good sign. It means that we're doing a good analysis of these results. And if that's the case,
so
what do we do next?
What do we do if we have more questions than answers from building our threat models? It's amazing how many times you go through basic enumeration, right? You gather all this information. You're like, great, I put this threat model together, and you're like, oh, I actually don't really understand how that works over here, or how would an attacker use that to your advantage? So we have another step within the product security methodology that we put together, and this is called deep enumeration. Not every organization or every product is going to warrant deep enumeration. This is going to be doing things like binary code analysis, reverse engineering, breaking down proprietary protocols. remember back to my example about hacking that building controller, that was using a proprietary protocol. And the lesson learned was isolate what you don't understand. So we've built into the product security testing methodology a step to say, if you have the time, this is how you go about understanding those things that you don't understand at a much deeper level. So you're going to reserve stuff like this, and fuzzing it we have in here as part of this as well, for maybe your mission critical assets or very specialized cases, because it is going to take a lot more time and resources.
Sometimes it could be things like we see an application that is just communicating on a port, right? And the question is this encrypted? Okay, that's something we can analyze, right?
That's right.
But if it's encrypted, the next question, which will probably require deep enumeration, is can we break that encryption? Right? Can we?
And what level of effort does it take to break that encryption? Because it's going to go back and feed your threat model and attack trees on how difficult that is.
Yep.
So then, now we've exhausted. We've got as much information as we can possibly have. We've got some threat models in place and some attack trees. How do we go about looking at that?
Well, the next thing is determine if we have enough data to do something about it. Remember that the goal here is not to do research. The goal here is to apply countermeasures and do that as fast as possible, because we cannot, as I usually say, please put a piece of paper outside of our network saying, hey, please do not attack me, I'm doing my threat modeling, right? No, we're getting these attacks on a daily basis, and we need to be agile and fast. So that's what we're trying to do here, determine the risk. So now you're going to bring all of this into some sort of a risk scoring, risk matrix, and prioritize based on your threat model, based on the attack trees, based on the criticality of the assets that we're talking about. For example, if we're doing analysis on Zoom or Dropbox or a piece of hardware that's connected to your network, once you have information on what the attacker could do, and if they could elevate privileges, if they could execute commands, if that could lead into machine-in-the-middle attacks, based on the analysis of your business or your organization, you're going to determine whether that's more likely to happen or not, and what's the impact of that. So based on all of these, we prioritize, and now we need to submit some recommendations. What are we going to do, right? What are the countermeasures that we can apply to extend, protection time and to reduce detection and reaction time for each of these threats?
And these countermeasures are now specific to the way you're going to use the product in your organization, and are going to better defend against things like supply chain attacks. But some of you might be sitting there and be like, okay, that's great. You put together a methodology, but the proof is in the pudding, right? Show me, using some examples, how would this actually help me defend my network? So put together just a couple examples quickly on past supply chain attacks. And you've probably enumerated by now, like this would work for more than supply chain attacks. We're just using that as one of our examples and topics to talk about, because a lot of people have struggle in defending against these type of attacks, the two categories that we opened our presentation with. So I've just got a couple examples here. Who here remembers the big vulnerability in Barracuda not all that long ago, right? This was at the end of 2023. It was graciously put out on Christmas Eve. I really appreciate the attackers using those days to put out these type of vulnerabilities. That's super helpful. And this was a third-party library. So remember, two categories of supply chain attacks, either breach-based or underlying library or SDK. This is the underlying library or SDK. It was confirmed that this was used by UNC 4841. And it was interesting, when this was posted, I saw all this blow up on social media and everywhere about this vulnerability and how serious it was and everything. And I thought to myself, and then I actually posted it on social media, who's asking the question, where else is this library used? Because the vulnerability in itself was not directly in Barracuda's proprietary code. It was in a dependency that they had. So who else is using this library? And this is where product security testing would help you defend against this in your organization. Having gone through the process of the other things on your network and understanding what are my dependencies, building that threat model, now you know maybe I don't use Barracuda, but I might use this other software that has this vulnerability. Am I making sure that I'm updating that piece of software to defend myself from that position? And there's always also the possibility, of course, and I understand this is kind of a corner case, but maybe if you did this, you would have reported this to Barracuda before as well as you're analyzing the products. So interesting use case to think about.
Which is not the ultimate objective, right?
No, it's definitely
testing,
not.
But it's something that it could happen. You find out something new, you want to report it using responsible disclosure, right?
Absolutely, which we have in the flowchart as well. Okay, so let's talk about another example. Back in 2021, April timeframe, there was and this is the breach-based supply chain attack. So CodeCov was breached. There's public reports out about this. I'm going to give you the 2-second version. Compromised credentials led to code modification. Code modification got sent to all the customers, and customers ended up, attackers were able to get into customers' network, right? This is very, very classic chain of attack for this vulnerability. And we do not control, as defenders, that initial breach point, right? There's nothing that you're going to do on your network to stop that initial attack from happening. What's interesting in this particular case is the code that was leveraged is called through an open source script provided by CodeCov. It's a very popular script, this bash uploader script, and you can see I have a screenshot of a portion of it on the slide. Now it's deprecated now, it's not in production, they took it out for the reason I'm about to tell you. But as part of the product security testing methodology, we encourage you to look at the code that you're going to be running on your network, especially if it's open source. You know, Ismael talked about black box testing, and oftentimes we don't have the code, but when we do, we want to take advantage of that. So here, if we look at the very top of the script, it might be hard to read, there's a bash command, and they're doing something called curl bashing. How many people in the room have heard of that before, that term curl bashing? I see one hand go up, and maybe 2 or 3, right? If you were to Google curl bashing, one of the first things that comes up is it's a very bad idea, right? So you don't have to know a whole lot about it, and you're going to instantly be plagued with articles saying don't do this. And the reason why we don't want to do this is essentially you're executing code directly into bash that you're downloading from the internet without verifying it.
What can go wrong? What
could possibly go wrong, right? So how does product security testing help you in this instance? Well, if you would have reviewed the CodeCov before or even after you started using it, and you recognize that you're using this open source script and there's this curl bashing command, you can now take action to prevent that from being a problem on your network. Some of the actions you can take is you can choose not to use this open source script and write your own, or you can choose to remove this line. You could choose to download it independently before you executed it, scan it, set alerts for if it's used, all kinds of different things that are going to help you be better prepared that if an attack happened in this area. One more example, just for fun. There was a supply chain attack on a company, on Click Studios. It was a password state. They're a password manager, if you're not familiar with them. And their main update website, which is clickstudio.com.au, got compromised. And so there was a period of time, about 28 hours or so, where if you updated that software, you were downloading in a completely additional DLL that was malicious, right? Obviously, the attackers used for their purpose. So how would product security testing helping you here? Well, oftentimes, one of the things we emphasize is you should be looking at the update process for the applications that you're running in your network, which means that, generally speaking, you're going to have an understanding of 2 things. One, where's the update supposed to be coming from? So if that changes, you can easily put in alerting rules to say, hey, it's no longer coming from the right place. The other thing we encourage is what is included, generally speaking, in that update. Now, yes, obviously it's an update. You're not going to hash it and check the hash every time because the update is changing. But the addition of a completely unbefore-used DLL with a different name is pretty malicious, and at least you can is suspicious. At least you could put process in place and say, maybe wait to install that until I look at that update package, and make sure that it's not something that's malicious. So just a couple of examples of attacks that have happened over the last several years where deploying product security testing is going to help you.
So hopefully at this point you understand how useful product security testing is, this type of DNA testing to know what we're bringing into our network. But let's face it, right? You're probably thinking, but do we have to do this for every single piece of software or hardware that we have connected to our environment? That would be like eating the elephant, right? And yeah, you can try to eat it one bite at a time, but I prefer to use this philosophy that I call divide and conquer, right? What is that? Well, essentially prioritizing. I think this is one of the hardest things that we have to do as defenders. There's so many vulnerabilities, right? We're talking about what, thousands of vulnerabilities?
Something like 36,000 or something last year, or 40,000.
Within a year, right? And then 90% of them, or the high percentage of them, they're gonna be critical. So if you're just chasing those vulnerabilities, you're gonna be like playing whack-a-mole, right? We need to prioritize. So how can we prioritize? Where do you start your initial testing efforts? I think that we all understand that if we're going to be introducing something new, there's a new product, software, or hardware that we're going to be bringing into a network that is sensitive, that is going to have access to critical business data. We want to do this. But are we going to do this retroactively as well for everything that we have? Well, we're giving you some tips here on where to get started and how to prioritize. CISA, for example, tells you two things. Start with products that require privileged access. Think about those. What are some of those products that require privileged access? I'm thinking maybe endpoint security tools, right? They typically run with elevated privileges. Anything that has access to the crown jewels, right? Anything that we're going to run with domain admin privileges. Scanners, right? Typically run, vulnerability scanners run with these privileges. Security tools, IT administration tools, remote access tools. SolarWinds, anybody? Right? I think we all understood that. If we have something that has, the keys to the kingdom, we want to make sure that we protect them appropriately. So that's one of the ways in which we can prioritize. The other one is anything that requires frequent communication with the vendor's network. Again, we learned that with SolarWinds very quickly. What are the tools that you have that are connected to the internet, beaconing out? Should we say that, beaconing out?
Yeah.
Getting updates from the vendor directly, and that we may assume with maybe too much implicit trust that they are good and there's not going to be any supply chain attacks. That can give you more focus. Other things that we want to do, NIST, for example, gives you an idea on how to implement this as part of your risk management process. Again, prioritize. Focus on your key mission or business processes. If anybody has in your organization a business continuity plan, right? Maybe that's a good starting point because that tells you what are the most critical services or products that they need to be up and running. What's the maximum tolerable downtime for those? We're not really concerned with availability here, but you could use that information to start prioritizing those business processes, and then from there start looking at dependencies, as we said before. What are the systems that are processing these data, that are maintaining these critical business processes? That's going to help us to maintain an inventory of now the software licenses we have now, the ones we're going to have in the future, look at maybe the dependencies, SBOMs and all of that, understand who has access to those, and documenting this. This is key, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
we get it. We're technical people. We don't like documented stuff. But that documentation doesn't have to be boring. Like, for example, Doug and I, we have done this for years using Jupyter notebooks. You can include some automation as part of those scripts, and then start using some of these open source research resources to maybe run some scripts, get some additional information, maybe talk to the APIs with your asset management tools, and document those threats, even like attack trees, right? You can use automation around that to start documenting the attack trees for each of these different things. Now, we all follow these standards. I was talking about best practices before. NIST is great to tell you what you need to do, not necessarily how to do it. So in the spirit of talking something more practical, how can you do that? Well, I'm a big fan of some of these tools. Pink Castle. Anybody knows Pink Castle? Something you can use for free. It's very similar to Bloodhound, which attackers have abused for many years. And Pink Castle is more like a defensive tool that implements the same idea. It's not really focused on vulnerabilities, but focused on weaknesses, finding places where you have put excessive trust in your domain, in your organization. So that can pinpoint maybe areas where you can now start doing product security testing over there. By the way, we have seen recently attackers dropping Pink Castle on customers' environments too. So if you don't use Pink Castle and then all of a sudden it shows up on your network, you may want to validate who's dropping that. Flow data. We all have NetFlow, right, in our organizations. Maybe the network team consumes that, but we use it for availability purposes, not necessarily for security purposes. NetFlow data can just tell you a lot about who's talking to who. How does the data flow, north, south, east, west, on hybrid environments, on your cloud workloads, on-prem. You can use this to pinpoint some of those places where you want to start doing this type of product security testing. Zeek, I'm a big fan of that as well, as a way of understanding what your network flows look like. And then you probably have some asset management, and you have some security continuous vulnerability assessments, but always validate these things with out-of-band sensors. I'm a big fan of those sensors that can give me DNS traffic. For example, if you don't have any, I'm gonna call Barracuda because we called them before, right? If you don't have any Barracuda software or hardware, and you see DNS traffic going out to Barracuda servers, well, why is that, right? That might give you visibility into some of these products reaching out to vendor sites, maybe things you don't know in your organization. Next generation firewall logs that can also give you information about the applications that are being used. Dropbox, Zoom, Evernote, or a lot of these things that you probably want to see who's using this. My executives are running these products. Are they running these products on systems that have access to critical information? How about my DevOps teams? Last year I was here doing a presentation on Mac OS threats, and we said, look, who are using Mac OS? Executives and developers. So don't you think that those have access to critical information? In many cases, access to the keys of these repos on GitHub, or code that we run in production on the cloud. So focus on these things. All of this can give you some prioritization so you can do your product security testing there. And of course, we couldn't finish this presentation without talking about AI. And there's actually a very cool project called Stride GPT. And Stride GPT takes a description of the application that you're trying to build, or the application that you already have. You supply it with some information, and you can click on create a threat model for this, create an attack tree, and tell me more about the mitigations. Now, this is something that I would do at the beginning of the project to work as a brainstorming, right? If you had a team of people that you could brainstorm with, you're probably going to come up with the same answers or similar answers. But that's not a very repetitive process, and different people may give you different ideas. So I would use this as a brainstorming, right, to augment some of the things that I may have not come up with. But this has shortcomings, right?
Yeah,
what is that you're not going to find if you do this?
Absolutely, and it's limited by the information that it has or that it's been provided. So once again, AI is not ends up being the end-all to be-all easy button, but even if you were to take some of the basic enumeration information that you gather and then provide that to the tool, now you're looking at something that's a little bit more customized to your organization.
You're only going to find public information. You're not going to find all these things that we found with the Barracudas, with all of this software that we just mentioned before. But it can get you started in the right direction. So in summary, if we had to provide you with some, or ask you something practical, try to identify your critical assets based on the tips that we just gave you, and try to do some threat modeling based on that, and identify maybe some of those products, hardware, software, products that you have on your mobile devices that may have those, that may give you access to some of this critical data, and see if you know everything that you want to know about that application. Maybe start doing some basic enumeration, doing some OSINT. What can you find around it? Can you run these programs in a virtual machine and look at what are the processes, what are the communications that are generating? What are they contacting? What servers are they contacting, right? Where are they located? This can be very interesting and revealing tests that doesn't require a lot of technical skills. And then from there, bringing this into some sort of a threat model that you can use. Try to integrate this into your own procurement process. Every time you have a new product that you want to bring into the network, especially in a sensitive network, you want to do this so you have information, you have knowledge. Remember what we said before? Knowledge is power, right? Now when there's a supply chain attack, the difference is that you're going to have documentation. You know where you have that. You know what's connected to, and you're going to be able to mitigate the impact of that supply chain attack a lot faster than if you're trying to figure out, so where do we have that, right? Do we have the library anywhere?
What was the biggest problem with Log4j? It wasn't the attack itself. It was simply figuring out where the heck do I use it? Yep. Or do I use it? Who uses it, right? This is a mechanism to help be able to shortcut answering that question.
Anyways, that's a roadmap, and we have 5 minutes left, and I would love to open it up for questions to the audience.
So thanks, guys. That was really great. The thing that I tend to run into is with smaller organizations, like the stuff you're recommending is great, but for smaller organizations, they don't have the resources to do anything more than plan, and even that is kind of sketchy. So any kind of thoughts for MSE, SMBs out there?
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very accurate description, right? Like a lot of small businesses have those type of issues. There's two main comments I would say for that is one, doing something is better than doing nothing, right? So if you do have like even one person or some limited resources, you don't necessarily have to implement the entire process that we're talking about, but at least doing some type of online research that we're talking about, which can be very quick, and using AI, for example, ChatGPT and those things are very helpful in that aspect, and starting that process is a huge win. Just doing some small portions of basic enumeration, right, are also a win. And then the other thing I would say is that there's a lot of ways to outsource some of this with MSPs and MSSPs and consulting firms where you don't have to end up doing all the work yourself, right? You can leverage a third party to do that for you that are offering these type of services. Those would be my two recommendations. Anything?
Yeah, just to add that, CISA is doing a great job at making vendors more responsible about the software they put out there, and they've been talking about secure by design and all of that. They're going to be, I think, announcing more things around that this week too. But there's no substitution to every business doing their due diligence, and if they cannot do that themselves, right? Since this is something that will affect the business, having some third party or somebody that will help with that will definitely go a long way.
Thank you for the great talk. Just a quick question. How would you, I guess, when you do these types of assessments, right? You're doing it for, I guess, all your dependency trees. But these can change over time, obviously, because like software is continuously evolving. So how would you guys, I guess, like recommend to deal with that, or any strategy after you do, like, let's say in an ideal world, all your dependencies and so on and so forth?
It can be extremely daunting, right? And at some point you ask yourself, like, when do I stop, right? And that's something that we talk a lot about in the methodology is you don't want to get in this cycle that you're just like continuing to going and not finishing the process. And the same thing when it goes to like redoing it. In a very mature organization, I would say that you put stuff on a cadence and you do it every so often, but really mostly for your mission critical and business critical applications. You're not going to feasibly be able to do this for everything. And we don't recommend you try to do this for every single application in your network. It's not feasible. So I would say if you're in a mature organization, some type of cadence that where you know you're updating, whether it's once a year, once every other couple of years. But then you also don't have to always redo the process to stay on top of these things. If you have documentation saying like this is the way the system works and these are my dependencies, you can just be more aware when you're hearing news come in that might trigger something and say, hey, oh, I remember somewhere on my network I've got something that uses that. Let me go back and look at that documentation. But you can't even do that if you don't know, right?
Even your ticketing system, right, could be a good source of information on when to review something. So if you see there's like tickets coming out of the use of a particular software where users are reporting something anomalous or suspicious, or that could be an indication that maybe we need to review the documentation and the threat model there. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. I think we have
one
time
more
for
minute.
One more question.
Any other questions?
And you guys can ask outside of the room. We'll be happy to take your questions. Otherwise,
all right.
Follow us, on LinkedIn, Twitter. We often like put out more information on these. The SANS poster has a lot more information, a pretty diagram of
way prettier than I
the
designed.
details and URLs of different resources you can use there. And if you have any other questions, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you so much.